I never expected to spend Thanksgiving evening sitting in an urgent care waiting room in Cedar Park, Texas, with a bag of frozen peas pressed against my eye socket and my phone open to a text thread with my attorney. But there I was, typing 3 words to Carol Hutchins at 7:42 inches the evening. The trap worked. She replied in under a minute. Good, don't touch anything. I'm already on my way. Let me go back to the beginning, because none of this makes sense without context. My name is Thomas Reeves. I'm 67 years old. I spent 34 years as a licensed civil engineer. Mostly infrastructure, bridges, drainage systems, the unglamorous bones of cities that nobody thinks about until something breaks. I retired 4 years ago, 2 months after my wife Linda died of a massive stroke in our kitchen on a Tuesday morning. She was 63. She'd just made coffee. The paramedics said she probably didn't feel anything. I choose to believe that. We bought our house in Cedar Park back in 1994 for $148,000. 3 bedrooms, a workshop in the back, where I built furniture on weekends, half an acre of land with a live oak tree that Linda planted herself from a sapling. The house appraised last spring at $940,000. The land alone is worth more than we paid for the whole property. That's Texas for you. That's also, as I would come to understand, a problem. My son Marcus is 35. He works in commercial real estate, which means he knows exactly what my house is worth down to the decimal point. He married a woman named Vanessa 6 years ago. They live in Round Rock, about 20 minutes away, in a subdivision where every house looks identical, and the HOA sends violation notices if your grass is a 1/4 inch too long. They have 1 daughter, my granddaughter Lily, who is 4 years old, and the single greatest thing to come out of the last decade of my life. I see Lily maybe twice a month. She calls me Pop Pop. She thinks my workshop smells like magic. She's not wrong. I want to be clear about something before I go any further, because I know how these stories can get twisted. I was not a perfect father. I worked too much when Marcus was young. I missed a baseball game or 2 that I shouldn't have missed. Linda was the glue that held our small family together, and when she died, the glue went with her. Marcus and I had never been close in the easy, effortless way I'd always hoped for. We were cordial, we called on birthdays, we showed up for the holidays. It was functional, if not warm. That changed about 8 months ago, and not for the better. It started small. Marcus called me on a random Wednesday afternoon, which was unusual. We chatted about nothing for 10 minutes, and then, almost as an aside, he mentioned that his firm had been going through a slow stretch. Market correction, he said. Nothing serious, just wanted me to know. I said I was sorry to hear it and asked if he needed anything. He said no, absolutely not, just keeping me in the loop. The next call came 3 weeks later. More details about the slow stretch, a deal that had fallen through. Vanessa's car had needed repairs. Nothing alarming on its own, but I'd spent 34 years reading blueprints, which means I'd spent 34 years learning how to notice what wasn't explicitly labeled on the page. Then came the visit I hadn't planned for. Marcus drove over alone on a Saturday morning in early October, which he'd never done before. He brought kolaches from a bakery in Pflugerville and sat at my kitchen table with the particular energy of a man who has rehearsed what he's about to say. We talked about Lily for a while, about the weather, about a highway expansion project I'd read about in the news, and then he set down his coffee and folded his hands. Dad, Vanessa and I have been thinking. You've got a lot going on with this house by yourself. The maintenance, the yard. You're not as young as you used to be. I'm 67, not 97. He smiled, but it didn't land right. I know, but Linda's been gone 4 years now, and the market is what it is. We were thinking, what if we helped you manage things a little more? Your finances, the property, just to take some weight off your shoulders. I asked him what he meant by manage. He got vague. Just keeping an eye on accounts, making sure bills get paid, being involved in decisions. He used the phrase peace of mind 4 times in 1 minute, which is a phrase I've come to regard the way I regard smoke alarms. When you hear it that often, something is burning. I told him I appreciated the thought and that I'd think about it. He left the kolaches. That afternoon I called Carol Hutchins. Carol is a 58-year-old estate attorney out of Austin. She handled Linda's estate and the revision of my will after Linda died. Sharp, direct, no drama. Wears reading glasses on a chain around her neck and has a way of looking at you over the top of them that makes you feel like you'd better be telling the truth. I laid out the conversation with Marcus. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. "Tom," she said, "I'm going to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly. Have you noticed anything else? Anything that felt off, even if you couldn't explain why?" I thought about it. I mentioned that 2 months earlier I'd gotten a notification from my bank about an attempted password reset on my online account. I'd assumed it was a phishing attempt and ignored it. I mentioned that Marcus had asked me, in passing, whether I still used the same financial advisor I'd had for 15 years. I mentioned that Vanessa had twice mentioned, in separate conversations, a neighbor of theirs who'd moved her elderly father into a memory care facility and how relieving it had apparently been for everyone involved. Carol's voice got very even. "Tom, I want you to come into my office. This week, if you can." I went on Thursday. She laid it out plainly. She'd seen this pattern dozens of times. Adult child under financial pressure. Aging parent with significant assets. First comes the concern, framed as helpfulness. Then comes the request for involvement in finances, framed as relief. Then comes the suggestion about living arrangements or care, framed as practical. If the parent resists, things escalate. The goal is typically power of attorney, either obtained by consent or by having the parent declared incompetent. Once they have POA, they control everything. I asked her what the odds were that she was wrong. She looked at me over her glasses. "I'm not wrong. We spent the next 5 months building a wall. First, I had a full neuropsychological evaluation done at a clinic in Austin. 3 hours of testing. Memory, processing speed, executive function, problem solving. I scored in the top percentile for my age group. The psychologist's written report was 9 pages long and concluded with language that Carol described as ironclad, documented proof that as of that date, I was cognitively sharp, fully competent, and entirely capable of managing my own affairs. Second, Carol revised my estate documents with language that explicitly addressed any attempt to contest the will or seek guardianship. Marcus was still in it, but conditionally. Any legal challenge to the estate, any petition for guardianship or conservatorship without documented medical necessity, and his share dropped to 0. Lily's college trust remained intact regardless of what Marcus did. That was non-negotiable. Third, I had a licensed security firm install cameras in my living room, kitchen, and the hallway outside my master bedroom. Not hidden in a dramatic way, just small and unobtrusive. I told the installer I'd had some packages go missing off my porch. He didn't ask follow-up questions. Fourth, and this one was Carol's idea, I started keeping a written log. Every phone call from Marcus, every visit, every unusual question, date, time, content, my observations, printed and kept in a fireproof box in my workshop. And then I waited, because Carol had told me that people under financial pressure don't stop. They adjust and try again. She was right. The Thanksgiving call came on a Monday, 2 weeks before the holiday. Marcus, cheerful, confirming that he and Vanessa and Lily would be over for Thanksgiving dinner. I always hosted. Linda had hosted every Thanksgiving for 28 years, and I'd kept the tradition going. I said, of course, looking forward to it. Then Marcus said, almost like he'd just thought of it, that he'd mentioned to Vanessa's parents that we were doing Thanksgiving, and they'd been asking if they could join. Her parents, Dean and Cheryl, had recently sold their house in San Antonio and were temporarily in a short-term rental while they looked for something in the Austin area. The market was difficult. They were good people, he said. Very low maintenance. He was sure I'd enjoy having a full house again. I said that sounded fine. What I didn't say was that I'd already written it in my log, that I'd texted Carol immediately after hanging up, and that Carol had replied with one word, ready. Thanksgiving morning, I was up at 5. I made a brine for the turkey the night before, Linda's recipe with apple cider and rosemary. I baked 2 pies, pecan and sweet potato. I polished the good silverware that we only used for holidays. The house smelled the way it was supposed to smell on Thanksgiving, warm and sweet, and full of something it's hard to name but easy to recognize as home. Marcus and Vanessa arrived at 2 in the afternoon, with Lily in her turkey print dress and a bottle of expensive bourbon that Vanessa set on the counter with a particular kind of smile. The smile of someone who brought a gift because they want something and knows it. Dean and Cheryl arrived 20 minutes later in a Lexus SUV, carrying a dish of green bean casserole and a pie from a grocery store bakery. They were pleasant enough. Dean was a retired high school football coach, broad-shouldered and loud in the way that coaches often are. Cheryl was quieter, watching everything with careful eyes. Lily ran straight to me. "Pop, Pop!" She showed me the turkey drawing she'd made at preschool. I told her it was the finest turkey I'd ever seen, and I meant it. We settled in the living room while the turkey finished. Marcus was on the couch with his phone, then put it away deliberately, which I noted. Vanessa sat close to her mother. Dean and I talked about the Cowboys for a few minutes, which is something Texan men do the way birds use calls. It's not really about information. It's about establishing a frequency. Then Marcus set his glass down and said, "So, Dad, I want to circle back to something we talked about in October." Vanessa's posture shifted almost imperceptibly. Dean suddenly became interested in the middle distance. Cheryl looked at her hands. I said, "What's that?" He said he'd been thinking about my situation, the house, the maintenance, everything I was managing alone. And he'd been thinking about Dean and Cheryl's situation, the short-term rental, the difficulty of the market. And it seemed to him that there was a solution that worked for everyone. I let him say the rest of it without interrupting. What he proposed was that Dean and Cheryl move into my 2 spare bedrooms. They would help with the house. Cheryl had a background in healthcare administration and could assist if I ever had any medical needs. Dean was handy. They'd pay a nominal rent, just enough to cover utilities. Marcus framed it as me gaining live-in support, them gaining stable housing, everyone gaining peace of mind. That phrase again. I looked at Vanessa. She was nodding with the energy of someone who'd rehearsed their expression. I said, "You want your in-laws to move into my house." Marcus said it wasn't really about want, it was about practicality. "Dad, you're 67. This house is a lot. At some point you're going to need help. And wouldn't you rather have family than a stranger?" Cheryl said very gently that they would stay completely out of my way, that they understood it was my home, that they'd be grateful. I said, "I appreciate the thought, but I'm not interested in having roommates." The room changed temperature. Vanessa said, "Roommates? They're not roommates, Tom. They're family." I said, "They're your family. I've met them twice." Marcus put his elbows on his knees and looked at me with an expression I recognized as the one he'd used as a teenager when he thought I was being unreasonable. That expression used to make me second-guess myself. It didn't anymore. He said, "Dad, be realistic. What happens when you're 75? When you can't maintain this property? When you're driving at night and it's not safe?" "I drive perfectly well." Vanessa stood up. She said, "Do you know what a 1-bedroom apartment in this area costs right now? Do you have any idea what my parents had to give up to sell their house?" I said I was sorry to hear about their situation, but that it wasn't my situation to solve. She said, "You have 3 bedrooms. You live here alone. That's not a home. That's a monument to being stubborn." Marcus said, "Babe." She cut him off. "No, I'm sorry, but no. Linda would be horrified by this. You know that? She would be embarrassed by how selfish you're being right now." That one hit differently than she intended it to. Not because it hurt exactly, but because it revealed something. She'd met Linda exactly 3 times before Linda died. She didn't know Linda. She didn't know what Linda would have thought. But she'd reached into the one place she thought I was soft and grabbed for leverage. That told me everything about what this really was. I kept my voice level. I said, "I'm going to ask you not to speak about my wife." She said, "Or what? You'll update your will?" Marcus flinched. Then he looked at me, and for just a second, something crossed his face. Not anger, desperation. The look of a man who is genuinely drowning and has convinced himself that his life raft is a thing that belongs to someone else. He said, "Dad, We're in serious trouble, okay? I lost 2 major clients this year. The mortgage is behind. Vanessa's parents sunk their savings into helping us with the down payment when we bought. If they don't have somewhere stable to land right now, we don't have anywhere to send them. There it was. The thing underneath the thing. I said, that is a real problem, and I'm sorry you're in it. But moving your in-laws into my home is not the solution. Lily had drifted in from the back room, drawn by the raised voices. She stood in the doorway in her turkey dress, with her crayon drawing still in her hand, looking between her parents and me with wide eyes. Kids always know. I said, Lily, sweetheart, can you go back and watch your show? Pop will come get you for turkey in a little bit. She looked at me for a long moment and then went back down the hall. Brave girl. Dean, who had been silent this whole time, finally spoke. He said, Mr. Reeves, I want you to know we're not trying to take anything from you. We just need a few months to get our feet back under us. I said I understood and that I wished them well, but the answer was still no. That was when Vanessa picked up the bourbon. I want to be precise about what happened, because it matters legally, and it matters for the record. She didn't throw the bottle. She grabbed it off the counter and threw it across the room. Not at me directly, but near me, it struck the wall, about 2 feet from where I was standing, and shattered. A piece of glass caught me just below my left eye. Not deep, but it bled immediately, and it hurt. The room went completely still. Vanessa's hand was still extended. She looked at it like it belonged to someone else. Marcus had risen from the couch. Dean had pushed back in his chair. Cheryl had both hands over her mouth. I pressed 2 fingers to my face. Blood on my fingers. I said quietly, Everyone needs to leave my house. Marcus said, Dad, I'm sorry. She didn't. I said, That was assault, Marcus, with a weapon. I need medical attention, and everyone needs to leave. He said, Please just let us. I said, Leave. Take Lily. Don't call me tonight. I walked to the kitchen, tore a paper towel off the roll, and pressed it to my cheek. Behind me, I heard Vanessa crying, Dean's low voice, the shuffle of people gathering things. I stood at my kitchen window and watched the live oak tree in the backyard until I heard the front door close. Then I took out my phone and texted Carol Hutchins. The trap worked. She was there within 45 minutes. I'd already driven myself to the urgent care clinic on Whitestone Boulevard, gotten the cut cleaned and closed with 2 butterfly strips, and was sitting in a plastic chair with a bag of ice from the front desk when she walked in, wearing jeans and a fleece jacket, reading glasses already on, phone already out. She looked at my face. She said, Did you keep it together in there? I said, I didn't raise my voice once. She said, Good, tell me everything. I told her everything. She recorded it on her phone with my permission, asked clarifying questions, and made notes. She asked about the bourbon bottle. Glass or plastic? How close? Whether I thought it was aimed at me or thrown in general. I said I believed it was aimed at the wall, not at me, but that the glass had struck me regardless. She said, In Texas, that's still assault. Doesn't matter if she was aiming at the wall. You were in the foreseeable zone of harm. She called the Williamson County Sheriff's Department from the waiting room while I got my tetanus booster updated. 2 deputies arrived 30 minutes later, professional and unhurried in the way of people who respond to Thanksgiving calls regularly. They took my statement, photographed the cut on my face, photographed the shattered bottle and photos I'd taken before leaving my house. They asked if I wanted to press charges. I said yes. Carol drove me home afterward. My house was quiet in the way that only houses with recent shouting can be quiet. The turkey was still in the oven on warm. The pecan pie was untouched. A green bean casserole sat on my counter and I threw it directly in the trash. Carol and I reviewed the security footage in my office. 3 angles caught the living room. You could see Vanessa's face, the trajectory of her arm, the bottle leaving her hand, the explosion of glass, my hand going to my face. You could hear everything clearly. Carol watched it twice. She said, This is textbook. I asked what came next. She said, Vanessa would be charged. Given the footage and my injury, she'd likely be arrested and released on bond. There would be conditions, no contact with me, a hearing down the line. Given a clean record, she'd probably get deferred adjudication and probation, maybe anger management. The bigger picture was what we needed to talk about. She told me what I already suspected. The Thanksgiving dinner hadn't been spontaneous. The escalating pressure, the manufactured urgency, the presence of Dean and Cheryl, the attempt to access my emotions through Linda, it was a coordinated approach. Whether Marcus had fully understood what he was doing, or whether Vanessa had driven it more than he had, didn't matter legally. The pattern was what mattered. I asked about the password reset attempt from earlier in the year. She told me that in Texas, unauthorized access to someone's financial accounts, even an attempt, could constitute financial exploitation of an elderly person under the penal code if the person is 65 or older. I was 67. We filed the report the following morning with both the bank and the Williamson County DA's office. I'd been at a fly fishing trip in the hill country during the exact window of the access attempt, with a guide service record and a credit card transaction to confirm it. Marcus called 11 times between Thanksgiving night and the following morning. I let all of them go to voicemail. On Saturday morning, he appeared at my front door. I watched him on the camera for a moment before opening it. He looked like he hadn't slept. I opened the door, but not the screen door. He said, "Dad, please." I said, "The deputies informed you that contact with me was not prohibited as to you, only to Vanessa. But I want to be clear that this conversation is being recorded." He blinked. He said, "You have cameras?" I said, "I've had them for 5 months." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I didn't know she was going to do that." I said, "I believe you. That doesn't change what happened." He said, "We're losing the house, Dad. Okay? We're 3 months behind on the mortgage. My business is genuinely collapsing. Vanessa's parents are in a short-term rental that costs more per month than my car payment." I was desperate. I thought if I could get them settled somewhere stable, it would buy us time to figure out the rest. I said, "And you thought my house was the solution." He didn't answer. I said, "Marcus, do you know what I found 4 months ago?" He waited. I told him about the password reset attempt. I watched his face. He didn't look surprised enough. A man who had no idea this had happened would have been shocked. He looked instead like a man confronting something he'd hoped wouldn't come up. He said, "I was trying to check on your balances. I was worried about you." I said, "You were worried about whether there was enough to solve your problem." He said, "That's not fair." I said, "Marcus, I had a full neuropsychological evaluation done in October. I scored in the top percentile for my age. I am not confused. I am not declining. I am not incapable. I have an estate attorney, an updated will, a living trust, and documentation of everything that has happened in the last 6 months. Any attempt to claim I'm incompetent, to pursue guardianship, to contest my estate, any of it results in your inheritance going to zero. Not to Vanessa's parents. Not to charity out of spite. Zero. Lily's college trust is protected regardless. She will be fine." He looked at me, and his face did something complicated. The desperation was still there, but underneath it, something older. Something that looked, if I was honest with myself, like grief. He said, "Did you think I would really do that to you?" I said, 6 months ago? No. Now? I don't know what you do under enough pressure, and that matters." He sat down on my porch, steps uninvited. I let him. He put his head in his hands. He said, "Mom would have known what to do." I said, "Yes. She would have told you to stop using her name to manipulate your father, and then she would have made you a sandwich and told you to be honest about your finances 6 months ago before it got to this." He laughed, but it was the kind of laugh that's mostly something else. I said, "If you want help, there are ways I might be willing to help that don't involve control of my assets or my property. A loan with documented terms. A referral to a financial counselor. But that conversation happens after charges are resolved and after some significant time has passed. Not now." He said, "Vanessa's really sorry." I said, "She can be sorry in court." He left without arguing, which surprised me. Vanessa was charged 12 days later. Assault causing bodily injury. Given the security footage, her attorney advised a guilty plea. She received 2 years of deferred adjudication, 200 hours of community service, and a mandatory anger management course. The no-contact order with me remained in place for the full 2 years. The financial exploitation investigation moved more slowly. The DA's office reviewed everything Carol submitted and ultimately declined to prosecute on the grounds that no actual access had occurred and that the relationship between Marcus and me made the intent difficult to prove beyond a reasonable doubt. But Marcus's information was permanently flagged on every account I had, and Carol drafted a letter to him and his attorney laying out exactly what a future attempt would look like legally. He didn't respond to the letter. I didn't expect him to. The holidays were strange that year. Christmas I spent alone by choice. I drove out to Lake Travis and spent the afternoon fishing from the bank with a thermos of coffee and a paperback Western I'd bought at a used bookstore. I watched the light go orange across the water. I thought about Linda, which I do every day anyway, but more so on days that used to belong to her. I thought about Lily in her turkey dress, the way she'd stood in the doorway reading the room with those quiet 4-year-old eyes. I thought about Marcus sitting on my porch steps saying Mom would have known what to do. I thought he might be right about that. I thought she also would have burned with fury at what he'd allowed to happen. I joined a woodworking club at the Makerspace in Leander in January. 3 nights a week with a rotating group of retired engineers, a former architect, a woman who'd spent 30 years teaching art at UT. We build things. Furniture mostly. I'm currently working on a writing desk in white oak that I plan to give to Lily when she's old enough for it. Her name is already carved on the underside where no one can see it. In February, I got a letter from Marcus. Handwritten, 3 pages. He didn't make excuses, which I'd expected, and he didn't ask for money, which I'd also expected. He wrote about what it had felt like to watch his business fall apart, about the shame of it, about the way that shame had made him look for solutions outside himself instead of facing the truth. He wrote that he had started working with a financial counselor, and that they were negotiating with their mortgage servicer. He wrote that Lily asked about me. I read it 3 times. I didn't respond. Carol advised me to wait, and I agreed. Trust is not a light switch. In March, I booked a trip to Montana for June. Fly fishing on the Gallatin River, a stretch of country I'd read about for decades and never managed to reach while I was working. 6 days, a guide, a cabin, with a porch. Linda never cared much for fishing, but she always said she wanted to see Montana. I'm going for both of us. The house feels different now in a way that's hard to articulate. Not emptier, though it is objectively quieter. More mine, maybe. Linda and I built this life together, and the house still holds her in the way that places hold the people who love them. In the grain of the wood floors, in the particular way the kitchen light falls in the afternoon, in the live oak tree she planted that is now taller than the roofline. None of that belonged to anyone else. None of that was a resource to be managed or a problem to be solved. It was a life. It is still a life. Carol calls every few weeks to check in. She asked me recently whether I had any regrets about how everything unfolded. I thought about it honestly. I regret that Marcus and I didn't have better tools for honesty before things reached a breaking point. I regret that I didn't understand, when he called on that random Wednesday in October, that my son was drowning and too ashamed to say so. I might have handled it differently if I'd known. Or I might have arrived in the same place by a different road. I don't know. What I don't regret is a single decision I made once I understood what was happening. I don't regret the cognitive evaluation, or the cameras, or the legal documentation, or pressing charges. I don't regret protecting my home and my assets and, most importantly, my right to live the rest of my life on my own terms. There's a particular cruelty in the assumption that aging means surrender. That somewhere around 65, a person becomes a problem to be administered rather than a person to be respected. I hiked 6 miles on the Barton Creek Greenbelt last month. I taught myself a new woodworking joint from a YouTube tutorial. I read 2 books in the same week. I beat my neighbor Gary at chess twice, and he's insufferable about chess. I am not a monument to stubbornness. I am not a resource. I am not a problem. I'm a 7-year-old man who paid for a house for 30 years, raised a son in it, loved a woman in it for 28 years, and grieved her in it for 4 more. That house is mine in every way a thing can belong to a person. Not because of a deed, though I have one, but because my fingerprints are in every repaired wall, and refinished floor, and garden bed, and cabinet I built by hand. No one gets to take that because they're anxious about their mortgage. No one gets to walk through that door and tell me my life is wasted space. Last week, Lily's preschool called. The number showed up on my phone, and for a second my heart did something it probably shouldn't do to a man my age. But it was just a teacher asking if I would come read to the class on Friday. Lily had apparently told her teacher that her pop-pop knew all the best stories. I was there at 9 in the morning with 3 picture books and a bag of the small, individually wrapped Butterfingers that Lily had mentioned were her favorite. I sat in a small chair that was not designed for a man of my frame, and I read to 11 4-year-olds, while they sat cross-legged on a rug with the focused, solemn attention that small children give to stories they believe are true. Marcus and I have not spoken since his letter. Vanessa is complying with her conditions. There are legal proceedings still slowly resolving on the margins. None of that was in the room on Friday morning. It was just me and my granddaughter, and a story about a bear who wanted to keep his honey to himself, and the 11 small people who thought that was perfectly reasonable. Afterward, Lily walked me to my truck. She was holding my hand with both of hers the way she does, a technique that I suspect she believes prevents me from leaving. She said, "Pop, are you going to come back?" I said, "As many times as you'll have me." She seemed satisfied with that. She went back inside. I sat in my truck for a moment in the school parking lot, watching the other parents and grandparents and caregivers come and go, everyone moving with that particular urgency of a weekday morning. The live oaks along the street were budding out in the thin, pale green of early spring. I am 67 years old. I live in a house I own, in a neighborhood I've watched transform for 30 years. I keep my accounts locked and my cameras running and my attorney's number at the top of my contacts list. I make Linda's turkey brine from memory every November, and I intend to do so for as many Novembers as I am given. I chose myself when it became necessary. I protected what I'd built when it came under threat. And I held a boundary that no one had any right to cross. Not because I was being stubborn, not because I didn't understand the financial pressure my son was under, but because a home is not a resource, and a life is not a vacancy to be filled. If you're out there managing pressure from people who think your age makes you negotiable, document everything. Get an attorney you trust. Have your cognitive evaluation done before you need it. And understand that protecting yourself is not selfishness. It is the bare minimum you owe to everything you've worked for, and everyone who ever believed in you enough to plant a tree in your backyard. The live oak is 30 feet tall now. It will outlast all of us. Linda knew it would when she put it in the ground. She was smarter than anyone in most rooms, and the smartest thing she ever did was teach me, slowly and over decades, that the people who love you without conditions don't need to take anything from you to prove it. The rest of them can deal with Carol.